Good morning and welcome. My name is Teresa Campbell, and you have joined the PIM Printing Industries Midwest and PIA Mid-America Financial Executives Council program on SOC 2 certification and overall best practices on data security. A really important topic these days. We want all in attendance to note that you are placed in mute mode to ensure a quality recording. However, we really encourage comments and questions during the program. You can type those into the Q&A field at the bottom of your screen to be asked at the most appropriate time. So if it's related to that slide, we're going to interrupt the program and ask it. If it's general, we may hold it to the end. If you have technical difficulties, we ask that you put those in the chat field so our team can address those. Know that the Financial Executives Council is coordinated by leaders in both the North Central and South Central regions. They guide the programs and content offered 6 times per year. It's focused around financial reporting and compliance, data management and security, and financial policies and planning. Our council co-chairs are Matt Wills and Rick Riesgraff from LB Carlson, Carl Nathy with Myers Printing, Ken Rain with Daily Printing, and Ryan Wagner with Action Mailing and Printing. Ryan, let's get started with the presentation.
Thank you, Teresa. We're very blessed today to have Charles Kilmer and Matthew Wills with us. Charles has over 20 years of experience and is a versatile technology expert in server administration, virtual infrastructures, and information security. His long experience in a variety of technologies, he excels both as a public speaker and consulting advisor, and his pragmatic approach and deep industry knowledge provide the foundation for reliable and efficient guidance in information security. Matt Wills is with LB Carlson and SOC 2 practice out of Minneapolis office. Matt's public accounting experience spans more than 12 years, and during that time, Matt provided consulting and assurance services to clients in the manufacturing and graphics arts industries. And with that, I'll let Charles take over.
Good morning. Thank you, Ryan. Should be able to see my screen right about now. I'm Charles Kilmer with FR Secure. Last year, we put out our first annual InfoSec report. I want to walk through some of what we found in there and provide some guidance on what organizations need to be learning from what's happening out in the world today. First off, this report covered over 400 validated security assessments that we conducted in 2022. These are where we go in proactively and assess the security posture of the company. We look at administrative controls, physical controls, technical controls, looking for any opportunity the organization has to improve their security posture. We get a lot of insight into what they're doing and how many companies are doing things well. This also includes 55 incident response engagements. And this is where we come in after something happens. They call us, they're either worried that something's happening or something has happened and they know it. Our incident response team jumps in, looks through the information, tries to find the criminal, kick them out, help the organization make sure that the organization can resume to business as normal. A variety of industries are covered through these risk assessments and incident response engagements, and employee count tends to go from around 50 to 2,500. So just to set the tone of what's included in terms of what we're seeing here. Of those 55 incident response engagements, the vast majority were ransomware or pre-ransomware, some internal compromise that may have led to some ransomware event. We saw about a quarter of them were business email compromise, and this is where the attacker compromises some employee's mailbox and uses it for some nefarious deed. Talking through that business email compromise, we see that about 64% were through some social engineering attack. Another 22% were undetermined. The companies didn't have sufficient log data to identify what route the attacker took to get into the organization. So that's probably more social engineering as well. Through our risk assessments, we found that 80% of the organizations are testing their users periodically, and that's great. but we found only about 60% mandate security training to their employees. In my opinion, you shouldn't be testing people that you're not training them to pass, right? We need to do better at training our employees on how to identify social engineering, and more importantly, how quickly they need to report it if they figure out later that they did fall for some social engineering attack. Time is of the essence. The sooner someone lets me know they clicked on a link they shouldn't have, the sooner we can get in and kick the criminals out. For those business email compromise, we found that about 43% of them continued phishing. They would use that account to try to get into other accounts or other organizations. About half of them tried to commit some ACH or wire fraud attack. 86% of those frauds were prevented, and largely we see this from a lot of use of dual control. And this is where the account that submits the wire transfer is not allowed to approve that wire transfer. Great security control. It requires then that the attacker compromise two accounts, one to submit the transfer and one to approve it. The others continued phishing, of course. They're looking to see how they can get more access into more employees or more organizations, depending upon the mailbox that they compromised. They may have an easier time spreading. In every single case, we saw exfiltration, and this is where the attacker took some information out of the organization. They do this quickly because they want to have something of value. The moment they get in, they're going to exfiltrate whatever they've currently got access to. That way, if you do happen to kick them out quickly, they've still got something that might provide them some value. For those ransomware and internal compromise events, we see kind of a even split between some vulnerability exploit and social engineering. About 20% of them were false positives. This is where the company called us. They were worried something was going on. We jumped in, determined that there isn't any malicious activity. There's some other explanation for what they saw happening. And that's great news. 33% vulnerability exploits, 28% social engineering. We saw about 10% of them get fully encrypted. And in every single one of these cases, we were notified after the encryption had completed. So we couldn't do anything to prevent that. One of the cases that we got involved in did get partially encrypted. And that's still a great win. We prevented a complete encryption. But this means that there is no silver bullet. There's no magic option here. Just because you have a good incident response partner doesn't mean ransomware is impossible. But it does make it much more likely that it can get interrupted or stopped before it even starts. So being prepared is crucial here. Have a good incident response plan, have some good cyber insurance policy, have some good practice on that incident response plan. Of those 33% that were led or started by some vulnerability exploit, we saw that one of them had a patch that was released within the last year. Most of them had been published in the prior year, and one was even as far back as 2017. And what this shows us is that patching is hard. I get it. I've been on that server management side of the world. Things break when you install patches, and people don't like when things break. But these missing patches or vulnerabilities in the environment had an easy option to resolve. And for one reason or another, it didn't or couldn't be done. And these led to opportunities in the environment for an attacker. It's also very hard to patch things if you don't know you've got them. From our risk assessments, we found only 77% had a good asset inventory. And this is just a list of all of your servers and workstations, your firewalls, your file shares, which cloud service providers you use. Knowing what you have and where it is enables you to make sure that it's appropriately protected and to audit periodically to make sure that it stays protected in those ways. About 55% of those included their critical business assets, and only about half of them included mentioning their cloud service providers. So things like Salesforce or SharePoint or Office 365. Ransomware, the key here, detect early, report early. Like I said, those couple that resulted in full encryption, they reported after the encryption event had happened or started. We saw dwell times of 15 hours, very quick smash and grab, to 9 months. The longer the dwell time, the more damaging the incident. The attacker can take their time, they can look around the entire environment, they can find where the most critical high-value information is, they can try to destroy backups. And we saw that 80% of the time they did just that. Through our risk assessments, we see that only about 60% are testing those backups. If you need to restore from backups, that's a horrible time to find out that the backups don't work. Air-gapped backups are your best option here, and I know that's a technical term here, but talk to your tech teams about your backups. Air-gapped backups are where the backup data lives in a location that cannot be modified from the production location. This removes the attacker's ability to corrupt those backups. Having that backup data enables you to simply restore the data and then not even consider paying the ransom. If you ever consider paying the ransom, seek legal counsel. There are some ransomware gangs that are on the do not pay list, funding terrorism. That puts you in more trouble with the federal government. So be careful if you ever consider paying them. Cyber insurance is not a plan, and this may be humorous, but we do hear this. Yeah, organizations that have that view are doing it wrong. Having cyber insurance is important, absolutely. And we find that most organizations do have some cyber insurance policy. Only about 68% of them have talked to that insurance carrier prior to an incident happening. Crucial that you understand, what will that insurance carrier cover? What won't they cover? Who can you use to respond to the incident? How do you best approach them? Who's your breach coach? What number should you call? Having a formal incident response plan helps document and make sure that all of that information is well organized. Additionally, print it out. If your only copy of your incident response plan is on the file share that just got encrypted, you don't have an incident response plan. We find that about half of them actually have one, and only about 22% of them document when and how to notify the insurance carrier. Worse, in my opinion here, is that only about 30% of them are testing that incident response plan. The actual event is the worst time to practice. Practice the plan prior to any incident happening with some made-up fake scenario to make sure that when something does happen, you're more well-equipped to respond to it appropriately and efficiently. Security culture is important, and leaders set the tone here. We find a lot of good information from our risk assessments on training of staff, training on the dangers of malicious code, how to secure and select passwords, having a formal training program. These could be better, but that's not bad. Only about 24% of them have specialized training for senior executives. And this is an important aspect because con artists will target senior executives because they hold more authority in the organization. If an attacker gets into an executive's mailbox and they tell an employee to do something, that employee is real likely to do it, no questions asked. So there are special security concerns, things that senior executives need to know about so they can avoid falling into those traps. So some key learnings here. You can't secure what you don't know exists. Get that asset inventory created, make sure it's complete and maintained over time. Improve your vulnerability management. Make sure these vulnerabilities are getting patched and configured to remove the opportunities for these attackers. Log everything. Have a brainstorming session with your team. Consider if some security incident were to happen today. What questions would you be asking your team? How'd they get in? What'd they take? What'd they go? What files did they access? What did they do while they were in here? Ask your team, can you answer those questions with the log data you have today? If they can't, figure out what it's going to take to make it so they can. Multi-factor authentication on everything, and we'll talk a little bit about that on the next slide as well. Preparation is key. Have a good incident response plan, but practice it prior to something happening. Train your employees, but train your executives. Train everybody. Security is not easy. I get it. For as long as people have had things worth stealing, people will be out there trying to steal it. It's not going away. It's not going to get easier. People are the weakest link. We need to make sure that they understand what needs to be done, what they need to be careful about, and how they should report things if something does happen. Multi-factor authentication, these are tips that your tech team should be well aware of, but if they aren't, make sure they are. Don't use push to approve. That's where when you log in, you get a little notification on your phone that simply says approve or deny. When attackers encounter that, they found a username and password that works, but they're getting stopped by this push notification multi-factor authentication, they will strategically choose when to log in, maybe 8:15 on a Friday morning. Or they could pester the employee with repeated attempts until the employee just hits approve, and then the requests magically stop, right? Don't use push notification. There are some variants out there that are okay, but be careful there. Utilizing hardware security keys or authenticator apps, that helps take care of some of those issues. This is where the employee then needs to go to an app on their phone, get some 6-digit code that changes every 15 or 30 seconds, and provide that along with their username and password. Deploy this to all accounts that can log in, and this has to be on everything, not just email accounts. If there's any authentication point that does not require multi-factor authentication, attackers can use that to figure out what the username and password is. They can sort of split their work then. Let's use this authentication point, this logon form, to figure out what usernames and passwords work. And then let's go for their email and pester them with those multi-factor prompts. This report you can download and review. We've got a long version and a TLDR version if you want the highlights, either at that URL or this QR code for whenever you want to take a look at it. Matt, I'll release screen sharing and you can start your side of it.
Before
Thanks.
we do that, a
Teresa.
couple of questions.
Sure.
So there are questions about, the what ifs, if it were to happen, when do you get the FBI involved?
Sure.
If it were to happen, when do you decide, do we pay the ransomware versus trying to rebuild if necessary? Those type of things.
Yeah, and those are good conversations to have, and they can be handled best through the development of your incident response plan. Those decision points should be detailed in there. Paying the ransom, contacting FBI, here is our process and our decision on when and why to do that. Like I said, pay the ransom, very risky. Do proceed with caution. In terms of when to notify the FBI, these are all cybercrime events. The FBI is the field office that takes care of that. So your local FBI field office, they will take any reports of any cybercrime, ransomware or otherwise. So reach out to them for any and all cases, as far as I'm concerned. Business decision of, do you really want to on every single case? But great things to document in your incident response plan.
Do you have statistics on how many got their data back when they paid the ransom versus they paid the ransom and they still didn't get it back?
I don't have statistics, but ransomware is a criminal organization, and nothing destroys an organization other than bad reputation, or faster than bad reputation. So at least in the early days, when I helped companies actually pay ransom, we got the data back in every case. That being said, that's 10 years ago now, so things may have changed. But they still want to get paid for ransom. So if they get a reputation that you won't get the data back anyway, there's no incentive to pay. There are cases where the criminal organization messed up the encryption, And even if you pay, they can't decrypt it. There are no keys. There are also cases where they've messed up the encryption and you can get the data without paying. They don't like that, but that happens. So important to put that in your incident response plan. Go through some process to determine, do you need to pay the ransom or can you get it for free? If you need to pay the ransom, then have a branch on there, contact legal, make sure it's even allowed for us to do it. Contact financial, are we able to afford it? All those decision trees are best in that incident response plan.
Do you have recommendations in terms of small enterprise? So the printing industry is really made up of mostly sole proprietorships and partnerships, not a lot of huge corporations that have whole departments that handle IT fraud or that type of infrastructure. So there's lots of layers. And so some of them, they are their own IT, and some of them would be doing their own plan. Do you have suggestions for that?
Yeah, so we do incident response plan coaching, where we go through that template with our clients to help make sure it's filled out, talk through some sort of mini tabletops. Let's consider a ransomware. How would this incident response plan of yours be enacted if that were the case? If you're a small organization, outsource. Look for security operations center as a service type vendors that can come in, monitor your environment. Maybe they're able to provide some incident response. Maybe they're not. If they aren't, we're happy to help there too. But take advantage of vendors that can supplement some of those things.
Terrific. Well, I'm going to encourage those that are on the call to continue to think of questions that they might have from your presentation, Charles. There are no others in the queue at the moment,
Great.
so we're going to move on with Matt, but of course we want to encourage that dialogue to happen and continue.
Absolutely.
Perfect.
Happy to answer anything I can.
Thanks, Charles. Yeah, I think a couple takeaways I had from your presentation. It sounds like training, and when you think you've done training, do more training. As far as if you're getting push notifications, the employee should be trained not to just make it go away, but to alert somebody, right? The employees are the first line of defense and the best line of defense. It sounded like in your statistics, a lot of the problems were caused by potential social engineering and employees, not some high-tech hacking like you would think of, which that makes sense. It's the easiest and the cheapest way to go about gaining access. The other thing I took away from it is, there's all these concepts that from your presentation that roll into SOC, and it's a perfect lead way into SOC and what SOC could provide to your company and to the industry, and it is what it's providing into the industry. So I think it's a perfect segue. You guys should be seeing my screen now. So really wanted to just set the stage of what we're going to maybe talk about here. Really discuss what SOC 2 is. You've probably heard the term SOC 2 before. You might not know what it is or how your organization, it could affect your organization or what it even is about. So really dive into what it is, how companies and people use SOC 2 reports. And kind of go over the different types of SOC 2 reports. There are a couple different ones, and there's a distinction between them. So it's good to just have a little bit of a background, and then really understanding how do you prepare for a SOC 2 audit, whether this is your first one or your 10th one, and really the resources that are utilized in these SOC 2 engagements. Obviously, I'm looking at maybe the human capital and the other capital resources needed, time, etc. So that's kind of where we're going. So really just to set a background, what is SOC 2? SOC 2 is a standard, much like ISO, much like HITRUST. You might have heard a couple of those key terms before. But SOC 2 is governed by the AICPA. As such, you need to have a CPA sign off on the report. So CPA firms usually and typically are the ones providing SOC 2 services. There are other firms out there that fall under the AICPA, but mainly it's a CPA, or it has to be a CPA signing off on your report. It mainly follows the COSO framework. So all of the good internal controls that were set up from the Sarbanes-Oxley Act. That's kind of what the SOC 2 is based off of, but it also does take into account all the other frameworks that are out there and kind of meld some of those other concepts together. So, you know, the IT gold standard, NIST, things like that. There are concepts of that in this standard, but it just doesn't follow that. It kind of has its own standard, but it utilizes a little bit of each. It's not a certification per se. It's an attestation report. When we come and audit and give you an unqualified opinion, we are attesting to your controls being designed effectively and potentially operating effectively for a period in time that is historical. It's not going to be prospective looking, and it's not going to be a certification. It's just clearly looking backwards and attesting to whether those, like I said, those controls were designed effectively, or in some cases were designed and operating effectively as well. It's generally seen as a little bit more flexible than some of the other standards. By that, I mean, you still have to meet the criteria. You still have to meet kind of what the standard's getting after, but there are points of focus in each criteria that you can, as a company or organization, evaluate and determine if that is what's best for your company. Some of the other standards are pretty rigid, meaning you have to do this or you fail. SOC 2 is more fluid. There is, like I said, there is still a structure to it, but there's a little bit more flexibility in how do you accomplish these criteria and how you accomplish meeting these criteria. So there are two types of reports we'll get into later, but just want to bring them up. A type 1 is at a point in time. So we're just looking to see if your controls are designed effectively at a point in time. It can be any point in time, it doesn't matter, as long as that point in time has passed. Or there's a type 2 report, which covers a period of time. And in that time, we're testing multiple months that the controls were in place and operating. Really, the crux of it, there's 5 categories that you can be audited against for SOC 2. One is mandatory security, or commonly called the common criteria. That encompasses a lot of the other categories, but it doesn't dive into the niche category itself. So it'll have a little bit of each of the following, but it doesn't dive into detail. Then next comes availability. So are your systems available to your customers? Processing integrity would look at, are your systems processing information correctly? Confidentiality, is a deeper dive into, are you keeping confidential data that is not personally identifiable information secure? So customer lists, for example, maybe trademarks, etc., that are confidential, but not necessarily personal in nature. And then privacy, which is the most expansive category other than security. And that covers everything personal identifiable to you, social security numbers, etc. And that is the most complex and the most in-depth because of, obviously, the amount of controls that you want to have around the sensitive nature of that. So kind of, who is SOC 2 for and how are the reports used? SOC 2 really is intended for organizations that are accessing or processing or maintaining data on behalf of their customers. Their customers may, your customers may want to have an understanding of how your controls are positioned, so you are safeguarding their data as they're sending it to you, for you to either print on, a credit card statement and then mail off to your customers, or whatever the other services you may provide them. Those customers are really looking for, how do you as an organization and as a printer really keep my data safe? And heaven forbid, if you have to call Charles and his team because something happens, what are those, do you have those policies in place so that you can get up and running and you can mitigate faster? That's really what the crux of a SOC 2 is for, is communicating all of these controls to your customers. It's designed to meet a broad range of industries and users. So unlike maybe other standards, This can be used for customers who are in the health industry, could be in the banking industry, could be in the manufacturing industry, whatever the case, the industry it is, debt collections industry. If there's sensitive data involved and you need to communicate controls, SOC 2 can cover that. So it is designed to meet a lot of common needs of the users, obviously, if you're touching that many industries. The main key point of SOC 2, and we talked about all the time with our clients, is it can be applied at an organizational level, or it can be provided at a system level. So think if you've got if you're a printer and you've got a secure facility, maybe inside your manufacturing plant, or maybe you've got a secure printing facility at a different location. We can do a SOC 2 report on just that secure printing facility or that secure printing room you may have, or we can do it for the entire organization that encompasses both the secure and non-secure printing. So the flexibility of the scoping really lends credence to being able to provide your customers what they need to ensure that you're communicating your data, your controls effectively. So I know there's a lot going on this screen. We put this together a long time ago, and I love what this diagram is for these, the visual learners out there. So we're going to just start in the top left of the corner. We got ABC company. They deal with the user entity customer, and man, ABC does a lot for them. They do email marketing, creative services, mailing, direct data management, printing, fulfillment, and user entity or the customer is just sending them a lot of confidential information, personal information to ABC in order to fulfill all of these services. Inherently, the customer of ABC company is bearing a lot of risk by sending all of this data to a third party outside of their company. They no longer can control the data when it gets into ABC's hands. Now, contractually, you can tell when to dispose of it and things like that, but the customer still wants to have some understanding of what all ABC's got going on in place. And this is where the bridge really for the SOC 2 report comes in handy, because if you look down at the bottom, there's a lot of things that are covered by the SOC 2. ABC can communicate effectively all of the principal service commitments and the system requirements it maintains for everybody. It can communicate what infrastructure it has, what software it has, what the people are, how are they structured organizationally from a people perspective, maybe what some of their policies and procedures are. What are their hiring policies? What are their termination policies? What are their access policies for both physical, getting into the building, and just access policies for, their employees as they work through their computer systems? What kind of data do they keep? How long do they keep the data? Really the relevant aspects of how they interpret and assess risk, how they communicate internally and externally to customers, to employees about training, about updates, about any other thing that needs to be communicated. How do we do this? How do they monitor their system? How do they go about making sure that if something is detected, how do they not go about getting it resolved? And then again, at the bottom right here, you can see you could really go through and cover all 5 if you wanted, if it was applicable to the customer. But obviously, we always have to touch on security. But if the customer wanted more in-depth kind of controls and understanding of whatever else you may provide, we can do a SOC 2 report on that too. So that's just in a nutshell everything that a SOC 2 report encompasses. And as you can see, it's a lot of information that will help your customer really understand what they're getting into when they're sending you data, because nobody wants to be on the front page news, right? Or have their data be on the front page news. So this would really help them get a comfort level like, okay, you do have a good security posture. You do have policies and procedures in place to mitigate a disaster potentially. So kind of what's included in a SOC 2 report. I know we just spoke about just the real in-depth kind of understanding of what's in a SOC 2 report, but just kind of going at a higher level, there's really 4 main parts to a SOC 2 report. You have your independent auditor's opinion. This is where this is coming from us as auditors. We'll get to that in a little bit. You're going to have a section for your company's assertion. So you are actually going to have an assertion that you can that will be provided to the customers, detailing out that you believe your controls are fairly stated, that your controls were fairly designed and suitably designed, that you take ownership of the controls and you take it serious. So you're putting your name in signing off saying, yes, customer, we are designing these controls and we're making sure that they're designed effectively, and we're taking ownership of that. And that's key. I know other standards don't have that. I think just as a little layer of, hey, we're taking a personalized touch to this by attesting to our own work. Next, you've got a system description. This is kind of the Cliff Notes version of your entire system. It touches base on all of what I just talked about previously at a very high level. Think of it as kind of, I just want to know quick down and dirty what your policies are on HR or hiring, or how do you make sure your physical security is correct. Not necessarily detailing out every single control you might have, but rather just it's a paragraph form. It's easy to read. There are only usually a couple paragraphs on each section, but it gives a flavor of what's going on. Now, if a user really wanted to get more involved, there is the last section called the Trust Services Criteria Control Matrix, where this will go through every criteria and every sub-criteria and basically list out every single control you have to meet the criteria. And if we're doing a type 2, what tests the auditor actually performed. So this will detail out very explicitly, we set the tone at the top. Here's how we do that. We have board of directors sign off on employee handbooks. We have the employees sign off on the handbooks. It'll go down and you'll list 4 or 5 controls for each little sub criteria control. And then it would list that the auditor looked to verify and sample to verify employees are doing that as well. So it's very, very detailed. So that's where I always kind of go. You start with the description, get a flavor of what they're doing. If you need more verification or understanding of what's going on with a particular control, call it hiring practices again, or physical control, you can go to the relevant criteria and get more detailed and granular there. I think typically that's what most users do as well. So attestation, we talked about the independent audit report. It always comes first. Just like your, financial statement audits or reviews or compilations that you would, if your CPA does that currently for you, it goes first before anything else. And in this section, we're going to be communicating to the users what we found. Did we find any material differences? Did we state, we're going to state that we evaluated the description and the matrix against the framework. We tested it, and in our opinion, it is materially correct. If it's not, like I said, we'll call that out. If you decide as a company some of the criteria don't apply to you, we would call it out there. Basically, it's just a foreground of what we're setting the stage for what the users can expect. But we do put an opinion on if it's materially correct or not. Because this is an attestation audit. Typically, reports are turned around pretty quick. With 1 to 2 months afterward, after your period ended. So say your period ended December 31st, you could expect reasonably a report to be out in your hands to give to customers within, 1 to 2 months. Now, that differs a little bit from other standards where you have to wait 9, 10 months, depending upon the body and the framework you're going against. So these reports can be turned around rather quickly as well once you're done with your audit. I'll preface that again by saying, once you're completed with your audit, the report comes pretty quick. However, getting up to the audit, preparing for the audit, that takes a little bit of time. So again, really SOC 2 type 1 audits, these are just reports on management's description, in this case of ABC Company's data processing system, and the suitability of the design of the controls. Basically, what we're doing there is looking at the AICPA framework, looking through your controls, looking through your description, and evaluating if they meet the criteria for the framework and if they're designed effectively. So we might look at the controls, we might look to make sure they're in place, but we're not doing anything other than making sure that they're in place, that, hey, they seem to be designed correctly. We're not attesting to if they're going to be operating at all. So typically this is done at a point in time and typically only done once. So companies usually only get a SOC 2 type 1 report once, then they roll into a SOC 2 type 2 report annually, because the SOC 2 type 2 report, performed annually will also cover the operating effectiveness of the controls. So not only are we evaluating the design of the controls, the design of your description, but we're also testing each control to ensure operational effectiveness, which is a pretty high standard. So we believe that we have to get, I think the AICPA says it has to work 95%, in confidence. So we have to get a 95% confidence that this control works all the time, or is reasonably designed to work. So we have to sample quite a bit. So that definitely takes a little bit more time. Typically, like I said, they're performed annually. You can do it as low as about 6 months, but you really want to pick a time frame long enough for these controls to operate more than one time. So typically we see these done annually. Say if it's every December your period ends, you just go January to December every single year. Some of our clients go every 6 months on, 6 months off, but it really just depends on what your customer desires and wants to see. The norm though is typically it covers 12 months and then it's just done annually. So, we're all kind of finance people here, or we're always wondering what are the resources needed? That sounds great, Matt, but what are the resources needed? So type 1 engagements, now these are real rough numbers. Everything is definitely very variable. Like I said, it goes back to how many categories you have. Are you doing all 5? Are you doing 1? How big your organization is, how many employees you have, how complex your controls are, what kind of data do you handle, who is going to be using these reports, etc. What are they used for? So it's very rough numbers, but type 1 engagements start around in the 20s, so 20,000s. Type 2 engagements start around in the 30,000s typically, but again, it could be lower if you're a not complex company. It could be higher if you're more complex, or if you have a lot of different controls. Typically, we advise companies new to SOC 2. So let's say this is your first time ever going through SOC 2, and we'll get to how you do that here in a little bit, to complete a type 1 engagement first. Then roll right into an annual assessment every single year. Why we say that is we view that as a couple benefits. One, you've presumably been working really hard and diligently to get ready for a SOC audit. It might have taken a couple months or years, depending upon how fast or slow you've responded. It's nice to get something in your hands to show all your hard work is paid off for something. Also, type 1 engagements aren't as hard, in-depth hitting type engagements. They're a little easier to accomplish. It's almost seen as like a dry run. Here's what an audit would look like. Can we complete the type 1 audit? Because if we can't do the type 1 audit, we for sure can't do a type 2 audit. But maybe what did we learn from a type 1 audit that we can make sure we can pass successfully a type 2 audit? So definitely we always say if you're new to SOC 2, always do a type 1 first, and then just do a type 2 year period after that. Hard costs aren't just the only costs we see in this, and we all know that time everybody is too busy all the time, and what's the time aspect of this? Organizations often have an employee or employees in charge of gathering and managing audit evidence throughout the year. Or in a type 1 case where we're not gathering audit evidence, they're still having employees help manage that process, making sure everything is still in place. So we typically see, from a headcount standpoint, minimum 1 employee. Now, I'm not saying you have to hire somebody strictly for this role. It can be spread across people that are already employed in the organization. It could be 25% of 4 people's time. It could be whatever the math you want it to be, but typically it is one person or more's time in a year to really maintain and make sure you're ready for your audits. So for ongoing audits, what is that one person equivalent doing? Well, they're gathering audit evidence for controls. You know, you might have 270 controls that they have to gather audit evidence for. You might have policies that have to be reviewed annually and updated as needed as your business changes. You have to do a risk assessment. So they might be doing a risk assessment. You might be having to contact vendors, third-party vendors, to get scanning and testing done to meet your controls. So somebody needs to quarterback that all, or people need to quarterback that all, and that's where the time takes. And then obviously you get to, there's some pre-meetings with auditors as well, where we're doing interim testing or we're meeting and talking to make sure that everything's still on the path. So it definitely, there is a human capital aspect of it, and I think it often gets overlooked. Now, I don't want to say that as a, scaring you. I just want to make it all fully transparent. But small organizations and medium organizations, they do have either an office manager help, or they do use a third-party vendor to help kind of quarterback that as needed as well. Now, if you're not new to SOC 2, if you are new to SOC 2 and you don't have an ongoing audit, we really recommend getting a gap assessment performed prior to your first SOC 2 type 1, like we talked about earlier. And we're going to get into what a gap assessment is, but we find that clients who don't get gap assessments generally don't succeed and aren't very successful in successfully completing a SOC 2 type 1. Whereas if they do, they almost always are. Now, when we approach this with clients, we utilize FR Secure to help with our gap assessments, mainly from the standpoint of we want to be objective, and we want to be independent, and we still want to provide you as our client resources needed to successfully complete the gap assessment in a timely manner. For us to be independent, we can't help with writing the controls, implementing controls, really digging down deep to do some of the management stuff that sometimes or is often required to get everything up to par with the framework. Utilizing FR Secure, they're able to do all of that, provide as much resource as needed, provide as much management advice, or even writing the policies as needed, and then benchmarking it back to us if they've got questions. How do you as an auditor see this? So by utilizing them, we're able to create a win-win situation where we're still confident that if any questions come up, we can kind of steer you in the right direction, but we can also be confident that you're getting the resources needed to help, so you don't spin your wheels and waste time by just constantly coming back to us and going, does this policy work? No. Okay, let me go try to rewrite it again. Or does this, control, is this implemented correctly? No. Okay, let me go try it again. They're able to help you with all of that, and then we're still able to answer questions. So with that, I think I'm going to bring Charles in here to help kind of with the next couple slides. As definitely he helps with the gap assessments, and we're just going to kind of present together on what a gap assessment looks like, because that often is the biggest question we get is, how fast do I get a SOC 2 report or a type 1 report? What does it all take? And it's definitely a learning opportunity to fully understand what's going on.
Yeah, so I can jump in a little bit on what FR Secure does to help clients prepare for SOC 2, and that gap assessment is really the starting point of it. Agreeing on what's in scope, what's out of scope, if you have any subservice organizations that need to be either carved out or included in the overall SOC 2 engagement. But during that gap assessment, we're going through all of the controls with our client, making sure that our clients are writing policies and controls that meet the intents of the different points of focus within SOC 2. We're looking at all the documentation you've got. We have an on-site visit. If there are physical controls that need to be there, we want to make sure that they're implemented appropriately to meet your SOC 2 goals. a lot of interviews to help coach the clients through what SOC 2 is all about, what controls they're implementing, what audit evidence they're going to need to be able to provide when the auditor comes in, and how frequently they need to make sure that these things are being done. So helping to build that audit calendar as we go through that gap assessment phase. We also start building out that illustrative system description. Like Matt said, it's sort of that kickstart bootstrap document to get the auditor up to speed with what's going on in the organization. So that's the gap assessment phase. We do follow that up with some remediation support. That can
Yeah, I
be
think,
very.
Charles, let
Yeah,
me
go
jump
ahead.
in. I think determining the scope is probably the most crucial part of getting your gap assessment and doing a gap assessment and getting ready for SOC 2. What is our customer trying to accomplish? What is our customer requiring? In some cases, knowing that going into it definitely helps quite a bit. I know I've gotten pretty far, we've gotten pretty far down the road sometimes, and the client comes back and said, oh, we need this different, and or we need to add this or change this or take this away. And it's really just stalls. And you kind of look and go, well, we've done a lot of work and that's not really applicable anymore. Not bad work, right? Because security, improving your security controls is never a bad thing. It just, it delays the process for SOC 2 purposes. So really understanding and reading those contracts. What are you trying to, why do you need SOC 2? And what are you trying to get out of it before you do anything else is really the most important thing to start off a gap assessment correctly and to ensure that you get the fastest outcome possible.
Absolutely. If you don't know what you're auditing, it's going to be a bit of a headache to get any progress made. So some common misconceptions here: assessment versus audit. When we do a gap assessment, when we do a risk assessment, like I talked about during the InfoSec report, these are assessments, a lot of conversation. We'll look through some policy documentation to get a feel for whether or not the organization is fulfilling the needed requirements. An audit, that's where CPAs like Matt come in to make sure that the controls are being implemented. So an assessment, if our conversation makes me believe that, yeah, you've got multi-factor authentication implemented, I don't hear any contradicting information from other people that I talk to, I'm going to assess the situation as you've got multi-factor authentication in place. The auditor will come in and say, sounds good, prove it. Let's pull up your config. Let's try to log in as different users. Let's watch their experience. Let's review the system to make sure that what you're telling me is actually true. And that's why the SOC 2 Type 2 audit report is so valuable, because it is that auditor coming in and saying, they tell a good story about their security posture. We checked and they're actually living up to it. Any thoughts you'd have on that aspect, Matt?
No, and that's exactly, I might echo all of that. That's a nice way to frame up what a SOC 2 Type 2 report really is just proving out that your controls are indeed in place.
Teresa's back. I sense she has a question.
So the question is there a typical cost to the gap assessment?
Yeah, so it depends upon who you work with. When we do a SOC 2 readiness program, that'll come with the gap assessment. There's some remediation support. There's a mock audit. A lot of that can be carved out. We can just come and do just the gap assessment, no remediation support, no mock audit. So piecemeal. All in, you're looking, it can be between $25,000, $45,000 for a year-long program like that. So depending upon what you need, everybody would need the gap assessment, the remediation support, and the mock audit at the end. They're optional, of course. Additional costs if you're doing additional trust service principles, but that should give you an idea of the ballpark there.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm sorry, Charles, you'll have to stop me, or Teresa, I can't see you. So if there's a question, let me know.
There is another one here. Is SOC 2 Type 2 audit the primary report that data intensive print customers look to for supplier confidence, or are there others we should be aware of?
It is primarily the one. There are others depending upon who your data sensitive print customers are. If they're in the healthcare space, there is a framework called High Trust that some higher healthcare or larger healthcare companies require. So it all depends on what your customer is, what industry they're in and what they're looking for. The main one is SOC 2 and then again will drive the largest amount of industries. And it won't be so niche specific on an industry.
And I would expect that most are going to accept a SOC 2 Type 2. They typically, what I see is vendors or clients are going to ask for some security certification or attestation. They may accept SOC 2, ISO, NIST, something like that. They're going to want to review the report to make sure it meets everything they're looking for. But I would expect that SOC 2 would be on the list of accepted audit reports. We do see a little difference between American and European markets. American markets tend to go SOC 2. European tend to go ISO. One's not better than the other. They're just, for whatever reason, the different regions prefer one over the other. But if you're primarily in the US, SOC 2 should meet all of your needs there.
And those customers then are reviewing those annual audits?
Mm-hmm. They should be completely up to them.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. Another misconception is that the second year is actually harder. Some organizations will feel like they've passed the first year with flying colors and the second year should be easy. It's harder. Like Matt was alluding to, now you've got more to prove. That first year, there may not have been some of the evidence to support the controls because you didn't hire anybody new or whatever the case may be. As time goes on, more of those controls should have been exercised, and you need to make sure the evidence is there. Additionally, making sure someone keeps doing that task to ensure that these things are being done, following that audit calendar. That's something you need to make sure gets done periodically. So who's watching the watchers effectively? And then the last one, I'd say start early. Earlier the better. This isn't a quick process to get through. Like I said, our SOC 2 readiness, it's typically a year or two process we see for most of our clients to go from nothing to full SOC 2 audit ready done. We do have clients come to us every once in a while wanting to get a compliant audit by June of this year, and we're talking to them in January. I tell them it's an aggressive goal. Nothing's impossible, my dad would always say. Just costs a little more, takes a little more time, right? So we can meet these goals, but it's going to require more effort on your side. And sometimes that comes down to hiring more people to focus on the audit functionality.
Yeah, and I would echo that, Charles, especially in, being executives in the print industry here, you may not need it this second today, but the industry is eventually going to some sort of SOC 2 or other standard that your customers are probably going to want to require you to have if you are dealing with sensitive data or confidential data from them. And if nothing else, being aware that it, to your point, takes maybe a year, 2 years to just get ready and to then go maybe even a little bit longer to get a type 1 or even a year more to do a type 2, that this is really a 2 to 4 year process, and that you may not need it today, and that's fine. But just keeping your eyes out that it could rapidly change, and your customers from next year could go, hey, we need you to have SOC 2 by the end of the year. And now going, hey, we don't have it. So just keeping your eyes open and the pulse on your customer base. The earlier you start, the more lead time you have to do this and to get it accomplished correctly, and you're not rushing. So just keep that in mind.
And regardless of what security standard might be chosen in the future, whether they settle on SOC 2 or ISO or NIST or XYZ, getting one of these is the hard part. Switching to another is easy. Getting all of these controls It's a mapping task to say, well, this control in SOC 2 is this control in XYZ. We've already got it implemented. And then there's a little delta maybe between what additional stuff you need to do. So if anybody is thinking, well, I'm just going to wait until they figure out what's the industry standard certification we should get, don't wait. Get the certification or attestation now. That'll get all the controls in place and get you in the habit of maintaining them. If you need to switch, which I don't see as likely, that transition is not hard. Not nearly as hard as getting the first attestation. So common problems here, adhering to the audit calendar. I'd mentioned this a little bit, just making sure that all of the things that need to get done are being done on that periodic, the defined frequency. So someone should be doing the task, someone else should be making sure that they are. Executive leadership should be making sure that the audit person is checking all of those things on the required frequency. Make sure the documentation is getting maintained. We've had cases where someone was even maintaining documentation stating that they were doing a given task. And this was related to testing backups. When it came time where a backup was needed, it was identified at that point that the backups were not actually good and they hadn't been created. So watch those auditors too, the internal audit function. Verify that they're actually going through all of the steps of that audit process to make sure that these controls are in place. We talked a little bit about time to achieve. How much internal resource, I guess the comment I'd make there, it's largely dependent upon where you're at, how far you have to go, how quickly you want to get there. If you have everything to get done and you want to get there in a year, you're going to need some significant additional resource to make that happen. But if by chance you started the organization, security was first thing on your mind, maybe you don't have that far to go, and then a shorter time frame is easier with fewer resources. So how much to remediate largely depends on where you're at and how far you have to go. How much resource depends upon how far you have to go and how quickly you want to get there. But like I said, I'd tell clients, plan for this to be at least a year or two long process, and we'll know more as we get through the gap assessment.
Yeah, Charles, that's kind of going back to my comment, you know, if you've taken 2 years to do a gap assessment or a year and a half, it's really nice to have and show your owners or show the executives or whatever, or even your customer, hey, we got a SOC 1 type 1 report, and not having to wait another year on top of that. So that's kind of just to reiterate that.
So when is it the right choice? So I advise my clients, if you're starting to get too many security questionnaires from your clients, the SOC 2 might be that easy button. If you get a security questionnaire and you respond with your SOC 2 type 2 audit report, maybe those security questionnaires go away. Maybe not all of them, but 90-some% will. So it vastly reduces the burden you've got by maintaining all of those different security questionnaires. I do see it as a good demonstration of your commitment to information security, and your clients should too. So you can do that to help attract business or maintain business. We've had some cases, and I think maybe on the next slide, of when is the wrong choice to pursue SOC 2, or maybe that's just my story time.
Yeah, no, just to hit on the attracting business, we are seeing in the industry, you know, more and more customers, when you do have RFPs for larger projects, they might not say a SOC 2 is required, but they're definitely making sure it's preferred. If you have it, you know, and being able to check that box sometimes has enabled companies to attract that business where they otherwise maybe didn't have a shot at, or it increased the odds of getting them the job. Now, obviously, there's other factors involved. I'm not saying SOC 2, you get SOC 2 and it'll rainfall a bunch of business, but it will open up at least the opportunity for being able to propose on the work when a SOC 2 is required in the RFP or whatever else.
Yeah, I had one client come to us wanting a SOC 2 readiness, and when we talked about their reasoning for it, they wanted to get a better price because they're looking to sell the company. So they wanted a quick and easy report that they could get in like a month or two or something. We did not do any work with them. Bad reason to go for a SOC 2 audit report there. Teresa,
Yeah,
any other? Go ahead.
Definitely a bad reason to do it. You know, if you're doing it for the right reasons, it seems like it's a good idea. If you're trying to get a higher multiple, that's a new one. I've never heard of that, but I don't think it would give you that.
Yep.
Seems like a whole
Probably
lot of
wouldn't
work for that.
Right, probably wouldn't get you as much money as you invested.
Yes. And seems though there's certain industries where it would be more required, obviously healthcare, financial, insurance, and so on, and others where they might border on it if they're dealing with mailing lists that eventually get into sensitive information.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah,
Service.
It all depends, Teresa.
Yeah.
What you're dealing, who your customers are, what you're doing for the customers, and what services you're providing to them.
Yep. I see it a lot in service providers who service regulated industries. So a service provider that works with healthcare, their healthcare clients tend to want to know that they've got good security controls in place. High Trust, SOC 2, I've seen both of them satisfy that. So service providers are sort of a #1 target in my mind there, but it's applicable to a lot of organizations.
Well, and in the print industry, we deal with data, we deal with files, we deal with information on all things that we produce. And so how we handle that, how we maintain it, how we store it, how we retrieve it is all has a factor of security and something how we have to think about that.
Yeah.
There's a question here. What is the range of fees that a SOC audit would cost so a company could do a cost analysis to determine if a SOC audit would be an aid to their business?
Yeah, definitely a good question. I think we said, you know, in the type 1 type, it's somewhere in the 20s, typically dependent on the criteria, size of the company, all dependent on all the variables. It's very hard to just give a blanket statement. Type 2, they're in the 30s, depending or plus or minus, and it all again depends on those same factors: how big, how many controls you have, how many employees you have, how many locations you have, all of that. So it is a good point that, you know, I know we're talking about all this, but there has to be a cost benefit associated with that too, because if it's only going to bring in a small amount of work or maintain a small amount of work, it might not be the right choice for that particular thing. Now, it's never a bad choice to show your security commitment ever. So, but if you're just doing a straight dollars analysis, it might not be.
And then on the readiness side, range from 25 to 45, again, depending on which aspects of that readiness, which trust service principles.
And I was going to say, Ken, I saw that the fees those are annual numbers from my, the gap assessment's a 1-year type or a one-time fee. Once you're ready for your SOC 2, it just goes on annually after that. You don't have to do a gap assessment every year thereafter. But the fees for the SOC 2, yeah, those ones that I quoted, those would just be an annual fee. If you think about it, every year we're having to retest all of the controls over again. Not unlike your financial statement audit you might get, right? You might have the same auditor for 10 years and your fees don't go down over time because they know you. It's because they still have to do a lot of work and they still have to test all these new transactions every single year. It's not because we've done it enough times we kind of can gloss over and unfortunately not bring it down, if that makes sense.
Are there measurements as it relates to size of company, or is it always based on the type of industry and the data that they're related to? So once a company gets to 150 employees, they should be looking at always measuring or doing some type of audit versus, well, they don't really deal with healthcare. So even though they're large, they shouldn't have to do an audit.
I think, Teresa, it really depends actually on the customer and what the customer requires or desires to see. And sometimes the smaller companies can get away with just questionnaires from their customers or having their customers come in and test their specific controls they're worried about. Other times customers, you know, it could be a 5-employee shop and the customer could go, I want to see it. It's all over the board, unfortunately. You know, we do have some clients that are, you know, 10 people big or, you know, and 400 people big, you know, everything in between. It's really driven by the customer. And that's where, if nothing else, we can maybe work with you to tell your customer, hey, this doesn't make sense for the size of the organization. Can you come in and just audit us instead on the controls you want to see? And you can maybe work with your customer if you're on the smaller end of that scale. So I know I'm not really answering your question because it all depends, but it truthfully all depends on what it is. But if you are getting bigger, if you are 100, 150 employee company, or maybe even the 50, it might not be a bad idea to at least start looking at this and maybe start doing a little bit of the gap assessment or putting more controls in place, because when we talked earlier, we identified employees are the #1 reason why, you know, incidents happen. And, you know, the more employees you have, the higher probability, you know, more probability you have of something happening. So if you go down the SOC route, SOC touches on training, SOC touches on incident response, SOC touches on all those things that, you know, patching that Charles said, hey, if this would have maybe happened, we would have probably seen less and less of this. Not saying it won't happen, it just would have helped. So the larger your organization gets, even if maybe not required, it still might not be a bad idea to at least go through some sort of benchmarking to SOC 2 or a different framework.
How much more complicated does it become if you're a multi-site facility?
It depends again on what you're doing in those sites. I love the answer, Charles. You just smile and everything is always, it depends, but it really truthfully does. What are you doing in the multi-site? You know, do you have your headquarters in one area? Do you store all the data in one area? And people, you know, they just remote in and access it at the other location? Or are you sending and sharing data across the board evenly? Is one a secure site, one not a secure site? What are the different controls? So it really depends on how you've structured your organization to utilize the multi-sites to then really understand what that means from a SOC 2 standpoint as far as how complex it can get.
Okay, let's go back to the first half of the presentation when Charles presented on security and hacking and so forth. You know, we say a lot about employees and the potential to click on things, and there's a lot of risk there, but so much is going to a cloud-based internet infrastructure, and so much of our software and our day-to-day workflow is with the cloud, that there's always that backdoor or that potential that they can get in that instance. And because of that, there's so much more risk. It's becoming exponential that the chances there are more significant. How much more weight do we have to put in that area?
Yeah, and that's where I really emphasize the point of making sure your cloud service providers are in your asset inventory. Knowing that you've got them in the first place allows you to try to secure them as best you can. So those vendors, they should be able to give you their SOC 2 report or some other security attestation. But you need to check on an annual basis. Are your vendors living up to your security expectations? Are they doing testing that you think they should be? If they are providing you a web application like Salesforce, I would expect that Salesforce gets a web application penetration test. And that's where they pay someone to try to hack directly into the website to get other clients' information. And if they find holes, Salesforce should be fixing those things. I'm saying Salesforce because it's common. We're vendor and product agnostic. If you use any product I mentioned, we get 0 kickback. So more just as example. But
and in the print industry,
services, yeah, those cloud services, certainly you need to monitor them.
It's much more severe with workflow software in our industry related to major software and hardware manufacturers like a Kodak or a Canon or a Ricoh or a Fuji or I mean, all of them are implementing cloud-based software, which allows the potential for them to get into a system and shut down a multi-site facility.
Yeah. And they probably use that cloud connectivity to auto update. If there are security updates, they can push those down. Those updates can be hazardous. There was an instance with HP, I think it was last year, maybe early 2 years ago, where HP pushed out an update to all the printers and it bricked those printers, turned them into paperweights. They could not print out of them anymore. So it's a good thing to get those auto updates, but I think HP learned a lesson about the vendor needs to make sure they're being really careful about how those updates get sent out. So making sure you understand what security controls those vendors have, how those devices are connected to the to the internet, and then structure your network in a way that those things can't do anything else. If the device needs to talk to some website, your firewall should be able to be configured so that it can only talk to that website and nothing else. That limits opportunity for it to be used maliciously as well. So there are things you can do. Depends on what it is and how you do it.
Sounds like a lot of IT staff to manage that, to make sure that, for today, it's only talking to that one website, but then it has to have an update so that in the future it can't in the future talk to other websites and so on.
Mm-hmm. There's some technology need there, tech staff that's needed. So whether that's in-house or outsourced, unfortunately, we live in a very technological world and we need a lot of technological smart people to make sure these things are implemented correctly.
Definitely. Are there other questions from those on the call? Lots of good information today. Just on so many things to think about to make sure we keep our companies and our staff and our clients safe and their information.
I don't have a question, but just comment on, all the information. You got a ton of great information today. And to me, I think my takeaways are, if you don't know yourself or have the expertise yourself in terms of what you're doing, hire someone or get a consultant in to help guide you through this process, whether it be SOC or cybersecurity, and do things to make yourself not an easy target, right? Bad guys are looking for easy targets, the easiest way in to get somewhere. And if you can limit the easy way into your stuff, the more ways you can limit, make it harder for them, the better it is for you.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
That's a great point. Definitely some great takeaways. I wrote down several just for my staff, and I'm sure that everybody on the call has several on their list as well. The program is being recorded. Of course, all the recording will be sent to the members. Matt and Charles, if you will send PDFs of your slides that we can share. We will also share your contact information. So if there are questions after the program that are specific to you, they can reach out directly and say, oh, I thought of something and it was after we ended. We can allow them to reach directly to you and get those questions answered.
Absolutely. I love geeking out about this stuff, so happy to help.
Well, great information. Thank you for taking the time to prepare and for the presentation today. We really appreciate the knowledge and the sharing.
You are welcome.
Thank you to the Financial Executives Council for putting together the agenda for the information that we cover. Ken, who is a part of the committee, says, thanks to all. It was a really good webinar. And thank you to Ryan and Carl, who were part of that committee as well. We will get that information to you in the coming days. Chris and Ben, if you'll send that to Mid-America as well, we'll get it out to the rest of the team. Thank you to all who joined and have a great afternoon.